March 7th, 1945, 12:56 in the afternoon. A lone American reconnaissance patrol crested a ridge overlooking the small German town of Remagen, 14 miles south of Bonn. What the scouts saw through their field glasses stopped them cold. The Ludendorff Railroad Bridge was still standing. Every other major crossing over the Rhine River had been demolished. Allied intelligence had assumed the same fate for this one. The men on that ridge were not supposed to find a bridge. They were supposed to find a river. What happened in the next 4 hours would force Hitler to fire his top general, send 4 German officers to their deaths by firing squad, and cause one of the most decorated field marshals in German history to quietly tell an aide that the war was finished. The capture of the Ludendorff Bridge was not supposed to happen. The Germans had 2,800 kilograms of explosives wired to it. Written protocols, verified ignition circuits, backup detonation systems, every precaution the Wehrmacht could devise had been taken. And yet on March 7th, 1945, 22-year-old Lieutenant Carl Timmerman of West Point, Nebraska, led a company of American infantrymen across that bridge into Germany, while engineers sprinted behind him cutting fuse wires, and the Rhine River's last great defensive line collapsed under the boots of soldiers who were just as stunned as the Germans watching them cross. To understand why German officers called it catastrophic, why veterans who had survived 4 years of the bloodiest war in human history said the war was over the moment they heard the news, you have to go back to what the Rhine actually meant to Germany in the spring of 1945. The Rhine River is not an ordinary waterway. It runs 766 miles from the Swiss Alps to the North Sea, and for most of that length it is deep, exceptionally swift, and averages 1,300 feet wide. The Roman Empire built its northeastern frontier along it. Medieval German kings treated it as the natural wall between civilization and invasion. And in 1945, with Soviet armies crashing in from the east and Allied forces pressing from the west, it was the last major natural defensive barrier Germany possessed. If the Allies could not cross the Rhine under fire, they would need months of preparation, massive bridging equipment, and coordinated amphibious operations just to reach the eastern bank. That delay, in German military thinking, was the final sliver of hope. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt's plan was straightforward. German forces on the western bank would fight delaying actions, withdraw across the bridges, blow them one by one, and leave Allied armies staring at a river they could not cross quickly. The Rhine would buy time that Germany desperately needed, though for what exact purpose even Rundstedt could not clearly articulate by the winter of 1944. Hitler believed he could negotiate a separate peace with the Western Allies, splitting them from the Soviets. His generals knew better but fought on anyway because the alternative was the collapse of everything. By early March 1945, German forces on the western bank were in full retreat. Operation Lumberjack, the American advance to the Rhine, had gone faster than anyone expected. The 9th Armored Division, nicknamed the Phantom Division because the Germans kept reporting it destroyed and it kept reappearing, had punched through the weakened defences of the Rhineland with startling speed. On March 6th, 3rd Corps Commander Major General John Milliken called 9th Armored Division Commander Major General John W. Leonard and told him over the phone, "You see that black line on the map? If you can seize that, your name will go down in history." The black line was the Ludendorff Bridge. Nobody expected much to come of it. The task given to Combat Command B, under Brigadier General William Hogue, was to clear the western bank of the Rhine south toward the Aar River and link up with Patton's Third Army. If the bridge happened to still be standing, they were to grab it. That was almost an afterthought. A Piper Cub artillery spotter had flown over Remagen on March 6th and reported the bridge intact, but nobody in the chain of command put serious weight on that. German engineers would certainly destroy it before American armor got within striking distance. The situation at the bridge that morning was, on the German side, institutional chaos. The Ludendorff Bridge had been changing hands between commands almost daily in the preceding weeks. The officer originally responsible for its defense, General Walter Bosch, had been reassigned so suddenly the night before that he never briefed his replacement. That replacement, General Otto Hitzfeld, received responsibility for Remagen at 1 o'clock in the morning on March 7th, with American armour already closer to the bridge than his own headquarters. Hitzfeld dispatched his adjutant, Major Hans Scheller, to take charge and destroy the bridge if necessary. Scheller arrived at 11:15 in the morning. He had been in command for less than 4 minutes when rifle fire started crackling from the woods north of town. The man Scheller found in charge was Captain Willy Bratte, and Bratte was barely holding things together. His force of roughly 1,000 men sounds substantial until you understand who they were. 500 were Volkssturm, the civilian militia of old men and teenagers that Germany was fielding in the last desperate months. Another 180 were Hitler Youth. There were 125 engineers and perhaps 200 Luftwaffe ground crews pressed into infantry service. Bratte had been trying to destroy the bridge since American units were first reported approaching, but he was paralyzed by paperwork. After an American bomb accidentally detonated demolition charges on the Mulheim Bridge in Cologne in October 1944, destroying it prematurely, Hitler had gone into a rage and court-martialed the officers he blamed. The lesson every German bridge commander took from that incident was that you did not blow a bridge without written authorization from your commanding officer. This had turned every bridge commander on the Rhine into a man terrified of acting too early and equally terrified of acting too late. Bratte could see the Americans coming. He could see his own troops streaming across the bridge in retreat. He wanted to blow it. But he needed written permission from Scheller, who was still at ground level trying to organize a coherent defense while soldiers, civilians, vehicles, horses and cattle pressed across the bridge in a panicked exodus. Captain Karl Friesenhahn was the engineering officer responsible for setting off the charges, and he had a separate problem. He had requested 600 kilograms of military-grade explosive. What arrived was 300 kilograms of Donnerit, a commercial mining explosive, considerably weaker than what the job required. The Ludendorff Bridge had been built between 1916 and 1919, constructed largely by Russian prisoners of war, and built to last. The Russian prisoners had done their work well. At 12:56 in the afternoon, scouts of the 9th Armoured's 89th Reconnaissance Squadron crested the ridge north of Remagen and saw the bridge jammed with the retreating mass of the Wehrmacht's broken western flank, German soldiers and civilians and horses all trying to cross at once. Lieutenant Colonel Leonard Engermann, commanding the task force, raised his binoculars and stared. The bridge was intact. He got on the radio and reported it. Brigadier General Hogue reached the ridge and looked for himself. He did not have orders to cross the Rhine, but Eisenhower had left a standing instruction for every unit in the Allied advance. If you find an intact bridge, exploit it to the fullest. Hogue made his decision. He turned to Engermann and told him to take the bridge. The Americans moved down the slope toward Remagen under artillery fire. Pershing tanks of the 14th Tank Battalion engaged a locomotive pulling out from the eastern side of the bridge and immobilized it. The tank guns suppressed German anti-aircraft positions on the heights above. Then the infantry started moving. Lieutenant Timmerman had been promoted to command Company A just the night before, after the previous commander was wounded. He was 22 years old, born in Frankfurt in 1921, brought to America as an infant. On March 7th, 1945, he stood at the western end of the Ludendorff Bridge and prepared to lead his men across. He later said he could hear his own heartbeat. The bridge looked like a trap. Every man on it would be fully exposed for over 1,000 feet, potentially standing on top of explosives, under fire from both towers at the eastern end and from positions on the cliffs above. At 3:15 in the afternoon, a massive explosion shook the ground. The German engineers had detonated a charge under the western approach ramp, blasting a crater that halted tank traffic. Timmerman and his infantry were still on their feet. The bridge was still standing. He yelled at his men to keep moving. 3 minutes later, Friesenhahn hit the main detonator for the primary demolition charges inside the bridge's west pier. There was a deep, shuddering boom. The bridge rose into the air and settled back onto its foundations. The Donnerett had detonated, damaged the structure, but the bridge held. German Corporal Anton Faust sprinted from the eastern tunnel entrance and lit the manual backup fuse. The southeast pier charge fired. More smoke, more noise, more debris falling into the Rhine. The bridge was still standing. Timmerman was already on it, and he was not stopping. His 3 platoons moved at a run through the smoke and debris, with machine gun fire coming from the stone towers at the far end. Sergeant Joe Delizio charged ahead, sprinted into the eastern tower, took the stairs 2 at a time, and at the top found 3 German soldiers trying to clear a jam in their gun. Delizio fired several shots. The Germans surrendered. He threw their weapon out the tower gun port. Sergeant Alexander Drabik, a squad leader who before the war had been a butcher from Holland, Ohio, was ahead of everyone. He ran because he knew that if he kept moving they couldn't hit him. He wove and zigzagged down the center of the bridge. Near the eastern end he was moving so fast he jounced right out of his helmet. He did not stop to pick it up. His squad crossed behind him, not one man hit. Sergeant Alexander Drabik became the first American soldier and the first foreign invader to cross the Rhine since the armies of Napoleon Bonaparte in 1805. Lieutenant Timmerman was the 10th man across and the first American officer to set foot on German soil east of the Rhine. Behind them, combat engineers from the 9th Armoured Engineer Battalion were on the bridge cutting wires, tearing out detonator connections, ripping demolition charges off the girders, working under fire from the cliffs above. Lieutenant Humott led his 2 sergeants in a systematic sweep of the bridge's understructure, rendering every charge they could find inert. The bridge would not blow again. By 3:50 in the afternoon, all of Company A was across. Not one man was hit crossing the bridge. Within hours, 8,000 American troops had crossed the Rhine River into Germany. When Bradley called Eisenhower to report they had a permanent bridge across the Rhine, Eisenhower told him, "Brad, that's wonderful. Sure, get right across with everything you've got. It's the best break we've had." On the German side, the reaction was something different. Field Marshal Walter Model, commanding Army Group B, ordered General Fritz Bayerlein to assemble a counterattack force. What Bayerlein gathered revealed the true state of the Wehrmacht. He pulled together remnants of Panzer Lehr, the 9th Panzer Division, the 106th Panzer Brigade, and the 11th Panzer Division. Together they amounted to 60 tanks and roughly 12,000 men, critically short on fuel and ammunition. The 11th Panzer Division was so depleted of fuel it could not move until March 11th. Model ordered Bayerlein to commit his formations as they arrived rather than wait to concentrate them, which meant they arrived piecemeal at the bridgehead and were cut apart piecemeal. In Berlin, Hitler's reaction was volcanic. He called the loss of the bridge a military catastrophe of the first order. He fired Rundstedt on March 9th. It was Rundstedt's 4th dismissal by Hitler and his final one. Rundstedt received the news with a quiet remark whose meaning was consistent across every account. There was nothing left to be done. But Hitler was not done extracting revenge. He established a special flying court-martial with its own execution squad. 4 days after the bridge fell, this court sentenced Major Hans Scheller to death. Scheller had been at the bridge for less than 2 hours before the Americans crossed it. He was shot in the Westerwald on March 14th. Lieutenant Karl-Heinz Peters was also executed. Major August Kraft and Major Herbert Struble were shot the same day. Captain Willy Bratke, taken prisoner by the Americans, was convicted and condemned in absentia. General Richard von Bothmer, the commandant of Bonn who had surrendered the city without sufficient resistance, was demoted to private, and when brought before the court, seized a pistol from a court official and shot himself dead in the courtroom. He was 48 years old. These executions told experienced German officers something chilling. An army that shoots its own officers for circumstances beyond their control is an army that has begun consuming itself. When discipline becomes indiscriminate terror, when a major who had 2 hours to prepare a defense of a bridge gets executed for failing where 4 years of the Wehrmacht's best efforts were also failing, the institution has stopped functioning as a military organization. General Gustav von Zangen, commanding the 15th Army, had predicted this disaster weeks earlier. In late February, he'd argued with Model that the Americans would pour down the Rheinbach Valley toward Remagen. He had wanted to withdraw 2 corps from the Siegfried Line to defend the bridge approach. Model refused because Hitler had forbidden any withdrawal from the Siegfried Line. So the bridge sat defended by a makeshift garrison of convalescents, teenagers, and factory workers because the officers who saw the threat coming were overruled by a command structure that valued the map more than the terrain. Eisenhower had originally planned to limit the Remagen bridgehead to 5 divisions, while Field Marshal Montgomery prepared his meticulously planned Operation Plunder crossing further north. Instead, Remagen made all that preparation look like insurance on a policy that had already paid out. 7 American divisions had established themselves on the eastern bank within a week. Hitler threw 367 warplanes at the bridge. He launched V-2 ballistic missiles, the first and only time those weapons were ever used against a tactical target, and the only time they were fired at German territory. 11 V-2s came down as far away as Cologne. The closest impact was 300 meters from the bridge. He sent a squad of 7 Navy demolition swimmers to attack the bridge from below the waterline. The Americans deployed the top-secret canal defense lights, detected the frogmen in darkness, and captured or killed all 7. The bridge finally collapsed on its own on March 17th, 10 days after its capture, weakened by the failed demolition, the bombing, and the constant strain of the heaviest military traffic it had ever carried. 28 American engineers died in the collapse. But by then, it no longer mattered. Over 125,000 American troops had crossed the Rhine into Germany. The encirclement of the Ruhr industrial region began to take shape within days. Within the Ruhr pocket, Field Marshal Model watched 325,000 German soldiers trapped without possibility of relief or breakout. On April 21, 1945, Model walked into a forest near Duisburg. He had refused to surrender, declaring that a field marshal does not become a prisoner of war. In the forest, he shot himself. In the years after the war, captured German generals were consistent on Remagen. The bridge's loss had not just opened a crossing, it had removed the psychological foundation of German Western defense. The Rhine was supposed to be inviolable. That was not a military calculation alone. It was a belief held by every soldier and officer in the Wehrmacht, reinforced by geography and history, and 4 years of war in which natural barriers and prepared defences had always eventually stopped the enemy's momentum. When that belief was shattered by a running sergeant from Ohio who lost his helmet halfway across, something broke in the German command that could not be repaired. Not by replacing Rundstedt with Kesselring, not by shooting Scheller and Peters and Kraft and Strubel, not by V-2 rockets or frogmen or 367 aircraft. For the men of the 9th Armoured Division, Remagen was a single terrible afternoon that none of them would ever quite explain to people who weren't there. Timmerman received the Distinguished Service Cross, as did Delizio and Drabick. 152 men received the Silver Star. Timmerman lived until 1951, dying of cancer in his early 30s. Drabick lived until 1993, spent most of his adult life in Holland, Ohio, and when people asked him about crossing the Rhine, tended to redirect the conversation. He had run across a bridge because stopping would get him killed. The history came later. The sign the 9th Armoured Division posted on the Ludendorff Bridge after its capture read, "Cross the Rhine with dry feet, courtesy of 9th Armoured Division." For American soldiers, it was a joke. The kind of dark humour soldiers used to acknowledge something that almost killed them and didn't. For the German officers who heard about it retreating along the eastern bank, it was a verdict. He was supposed to make them fight through the river. That was the plan. The whole plan, and they crossed with dry feet. There is a peculiar irony buried in the history of the Ludendorff Bridge. It had been named for General Erich Ludendorff, one of the architects of the German military machine that bled Europe white between 1914 and 1918. Ludendorff had been among the most vocal advocates for building this very bridge, wanting it to move troops to the Western Front more efficiently. The bridge was completed in 1919, after the armistice, too late for the war that motivated its construction. In 1936, when Hitler marched back into the demilitarized Rhineland, the Ludendorff Bridge was one of the structures he reclaimed. 9 years later, American soldiers ran across it while the German officer corps shot its own commanders for failing to blow it up in time. German officers who heard the news on March 7th and said the war was over were not being defeatist. They were being precise. The Rhine had been the last argument. When it fell on a bridge held together by luck and undersized explosive charges, and the extraordinary nerve of 22-year-old men running through machine gun fire, the argument was over. There was nothing left to say.